All right. Again, hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's session, Setting Up Applitools in Cypress, a walkthrough tutorial with Colby Fayock. And Colby, we have you here with us? Yes. So learning by doing is the best way to learn, and it's what Colby Fayock helps others learn: JavaScript, React, and static web. His work includes technical writing, videos on YouTube, courses on Egghead.io, 2 books, and working with the development community as a developer advocate for Applitools. For any of you that have just joined, please note that you are welcome to post your questions in the questions panel of the GoToWebinar section, and we'll go through them during and after the webinar. So without any further ado, I will now turn this over to Colby.
Thank you for the lovely introduction, Patrice. If I can get that share permission, I'll go ahead and start sharing my screen.
Okay, that should be on there.
There we go. Let me just make sure I'm sharing the right thing. Okay, can you see the Applitools logo?
Bright and beautiful, yes.
Perfect. Okay, well, first off, everybody, welcome to the session. I'm so glad you're here, and I'm super excited to walk you through Applitools today. So who am I? Now, Patrice already gave a wonderful introduction, but I'm Colby Fayock. I'm the one hugging BB-8 and Kylo Ren over there. I work with the dev community as a developer advocate with Applitools. So before we dive in, you should have received a link from us for this repository. If you didn't, no worries, we posted it in the questions and I'll post it in the chat, but we'll be able to use this so that we can set up our demo project. You also have the option of following along with your own Cypress test if you prefer, as there's also a bit of information in this repository, such as exercises and just a little bit of context that we'll be using throughout the actual workflow. But I'm excited to get started with you. We'll be walking through how to add visual testing with Applitools to your Cypress tests. And one thing I did want to point out is we unfortunately won't have time to debug any local environments, but if you generally have any questions along the way, please use the webinar tools to ask. We'll be happy to try to answer all of them as I'm working through, or we'll save it for the end for Q&A. So starting from the top, I'm going to give you a brief introduction to visual testing. We're going to give a little bit of context to the problems we're trying to solve, and then we're going to be able to get on our way. So before I do, let me just go ahead and share that in the chat in case no one's seen it. And hopefully you're able to grab it there. All right, so moving on. So if I have a form on my website, I hopefully have some tests set up for that endpoint so that I know that I always am submitting the form data to the endpoint and that it works. But as we can see here, testing that endpoint doesn't actually mean that it's usable. First, I want something to go through and actually fill out that form. I want each input to be tested in the browser. That will let me know that it's actually working for customers. I also need to know that beyond the inputs functionally working, that it's actually usable. And with a huge website, we might not have the time or the resources to go through every single page manually, not to mention on every single device. Similarly with Gmail, if I make a search, that endpoint to get my results might work, but is the UI actually working? I need to make sure that someone can actually click on those elements, or in this case, that someone can't click on those elements. But I want to make sure that someone can visit that first result. I also need to make sure, again, that my search results are usable. This is going to confuse the heck out of somebody. What buttons should they click? Are they going to accidentally delete an email if they try clicking that first result? And similarly here with Amazon's quantity selection, where the modal still is opening, so current tests might work. But we need to be able to test these things the way that we as humans are actually using it. We need to literally give our tests a second pair of eyes. So let's start off with Cypress. Cypress, as you should know, is a JavaScript-based testing framework that tests real projects in the browser. It's easily installable as an NPM package where you can start running through a UI in the browser just like a human would. For example, if I wanted to log into my application, fill out a username and password, and make sure that somebody can actually log in, I can do so with just these few lines of code. Like our Safeway example from earlier, I can use Cypress to fill out each one of those form fields and even hit the submit button and confirm that not only that the API is working, but the UI is successfully taking that information and sending it along to the backend. But like we talked about before, this isn't necessarily doing anything to help fix what people are seeing. We need a way to give our tests vision, allowing them to see what our customers are seeing. And this is where Applitools comes in. Applitools is an automated visual testing platform, powered by AI, might I add, that automatically ensures you're maintaining a high level of quality for your apps. Back to our code example, we can add Applitools to the Cypress with the SDK with just these few lines and instantly get visual testing coverage. By running Applitools eyes on your project, you're using real images that show what the users of your website or app are actually seeing. This is critical, where a broken image might not actually show up in a failed test or an unusable form like before. But by using visual testing, you can make sure that you're catching all user-facing bugs. But part of what makes Applitools awesome is not only that it's checking for those differences, but that it's powered by AI. So just a really quick example of this, let's play Spot the Difference. How many can you find? I'll give you a few seconds. All right, I found 3 differences. There's the little hat logo, what's on the plate, and the ketchup top. Let's see how visual testing picks this up. Well, that's not too good. I thought visual testing was the savior. You probably couldn't tell, but these pictures were off by just a few pixels, meaning the entire image ends up being different. This is how a lot of visual testing platforms work. They're only smart enough to see a pixel by pixel change, which in this case isn't helpful at all. But when we flip on Applitools, we can see that we were able to pick up all the right differences. And looks like I was right. We have our hat logo, we have a plate, bottle top. Applitools was able to intelligently look at those images, spotting not only the differences, but why they were different, which gives us more meaningful results. And while Spot the Difference is a ton of fun, this is even more helpful in the context of the web, where between our 2 login forms, we might not have been able to catch that broken image or the alignment issues with the code scripts, but we're able to spot those differences with Applitools. And like our Gmail example, the changes are going to get highlighted right on a real image of the page. Those bugs never stood a chance. And we can even take this a step further. It feels like every day as developers, we have to support another viewport size. And between the different sizes of computers, mobile devices, and tablets, how can we make sure that all of our apps are working as expected everywhere? That's where the ultra-fast test grid comes in. And with the grid, we're able to capture our application once in the state that we want. And that ultra-fast grid will launch the app across all the different devices in our config, all in parallel, making execution super fast, or rather ultra-fast. We can easily capture our app on a ton of different devices with visual testing, allowing us to spend less time writing unique tests for each device. And we're able to do that by simply adding each browser to our config, whether we want to run the ones that we see here, like the major browsers or mobile devices, or if we want to run a test on all the devices possible, we can do exactly that. But once the test runs, we're able to see that right inside the Applitools UI, where we're immediately able to get visual feedback and confidence that our application is working everywhere. So with the power of visual testing and Applitools, we can build back that needed confidence in our development pipeline and continue to deliver a great experience for our customers. So now I know you didn't want to see a bunch of slides in this workshop, so we're getting ready and we're going to start getting into the code. So let me switch over to share my screen. All right, so as I mentioned before, we're going to start off inside this repository. Now, the most of this front homepage is really just some context about the workshop generally, what kind of things to expect, who I am, and just some things about the environment for what you want to get set up. But ultimately, what we want to see is this lesson plan where we already went through the introduction, just kind of welcoming to the workshop and what visual testing is. So we're going to go ahead and skip right to testing with Cypress. And at the top here, you can find that by navigating to lessons, and we can go to the testing with Cypress page. So what we ultimately want to do is we're going to look at some existing Cypress tests, whether that's the ones you're going to follow along with me inside of this repository, or if it's your own that you're working from at home. So I'm going to head back over to the top page of this, and I'm going to start off by cloning this down locally. So I'm going to open up my terminal, and I'm going to run git clone, and I'm going to put that into a folder called workshop. Now, inside of the workshop directory, I want to navigate into the demo directory. And here's where we're going to have all of our code, including all those pre-existing Cypress tests. So I'm going to start off, I'm going to open that up inside of my code editor. where now we can look through and see I have this Cypress folder. And this is just a pretty standard installation of Cypress. There's nothing really special going on. But what we want to see is this cart.spec.js. I'm going to go ahead and close this bookmark or the sidebar just so you can see this a little easier. But we really have this single test that we're going through as part of our example, where the very first thing we do, we're going to go to this demo page that I'm going to show you in a second. But what we're going to do is we're going to go through a list of games, as this is a video game store. We're going to find a game. We're going to try to navigate to that game. Then we're going to try to add that game to a cart, like a typical e-commerce workflow. But then we're going to make sure that the price is actually accurate when it's getting showed in the cart, as well as how we can navigate to the cart page so that somebody can start their checkout process. So let's first open that up inside of the browser so we can see a little bit of the context of what we'll be working with. So as I mentioned before, it's a relatively simple e-commerce store. We have a list of games that we want to see. And if we navigate to one of them, we see that we just simply have an add to cart button. And if we add it, we can see that we have this hover over the cart where we can see that item, and we can even go to checkout with that item. So to start off, we have that Cypress test. Let's see how that Cypress test is actually going to work. So to get started inside of this demo repository, the very first thing we need to do is install our Npm dependencies, just like any other node project. So I'm going to run Npm Install, and that's going to go through and it's going to pull down all the dependencies, including Cypress, which I already have installed on my local machine, but it might take a few extra seconds for you if this is the first time installing. But now we have all the dependencies local and ready to go so that we can actually start up Cypress. Now, if this is your first time working with Cypress, the way that I like to run it is I use these little scripts inside of my package.json called sciopen and scirun, where really the difference between the two is Cypress open is going to open a nice little UI for us to run the tests, and Cypress run will run it in headless mode. Now we're going to use the open so that we can see the UI. So I'm going to run npm run sciopen, and we can see that that's going to start that Cypress process, where eventually it's going to open up the Cypress UI, as we can see here. Let's see if I can zoom in a little bit, but we see we have our cart.spec.js, which was automatically found inside of our Cypress directory tree. So I'm going to get started by clicking that Cypress test, and it's going to open up a new browser instance where it's going to actually go through and it's going to go through all those steps that we already added inside there. And we can even see that happen line by line where it's showing exactly what's happening. It's finding that game, it's navigating to that game, making sure that it's on the right page. It's going to then add that game to the cart, and it's going to make sure the price is showing as expected. It's going to show our little cart menu, and finally, it's going to make sure that it can actually navigate to the cart page. So let's head back over to GitHub quick and see what our next exercise is. Because what we just did is we reviewed and ran our existing Cypress test, so we can kind of get an idea where we are at for our base. So now with our exercise 2, we want to introduce a visual bug. Now, I already have a nice little URL that we're going to use for this as I introduced my own visual bug so we can kind of see what we're working with here. And I'm going to open that up in the browser so we can see what that looks like. But as you can see, for the most part, it's exactly the same website. We can see if I'm going back between these two tabs, it's basically the same thing. Now, if I go through and I actually add one of those items to the cart, we can see when we hover over, we have a big problem there. We see that secondary navigation as I'm trying to point on my physical screen. We have this secondary navigation that's hiding the actual item that's in the cart. And worse yet, if I try to drag my mouse over that, it's closing that menu. So I can't actually hover over and move to that checkout button, which is bad because that means that our customers won't actually be able to buy these games and spend their hard-earned money on our store. So what can we do? Now, let's first try to see what happens when we run this inside of Cypress. So I'm going to head back over to my app, and I'm going to simply replace this visit URL with that additional URL. And again, if you're following along, you can find that right inside of the repository in exercise 2 of lesson 2. And we have this URL right here. But as soon as we hit save, Cypress actually already went ahead and started rerunning that test. And as we're going through, we can see it's performing the exact same steps. But something's a little alarming here. We see that we still have a green indicator here. That means that things are still working. And put my screen zoomed in a little bit, but there's not much to actually show in the UI, but we can see as we're going through here, we're seeing that same exact visual bug inside of the actual browser to the right there, but it's still showing that it's working, that it's able to find that button and navigate to it and visit the cart. The issue is when we're trying to navigate to that with our mouse, we're not able to hover over and drag over to the actual checkout button. Where with Cypress, because we're showing that cart menu, and then it's able to see that that button is visually available, it's still able to click that. So we can see that we immediately have a problem, and this isn't catching our actual issues for the application. So what can we do? Well, moving on to lesson 3, we can see that we're going to get started here with Applitools Eyes and how we can add visual testing to actually handle and supercharge our Cypress tests to make them even stronger than they were before. So what we're going to do in this lesson is we're going to learn how we're going to install the SDK. We're going to add our own visual test, and we're going to run that test so we can actually see the results. Now, first off, before we actually install things, I'm going to revert this link because I want to make sure that we're actually creating a baseline, which I'll explain in a bit here, what the perfect actual URL that we're working with, the one that we know is working right. So back over to the exercise, we're going to install the Applitools Cypress SDK. Now, I included a link here so that you can open it up on your own, where it actually shows all the information about the SDK itself, but I included, just for convenience, the exact commands that we're going to run in our terminal right inside of this exercise. But again, if you ever want to look this up on your own time, you can simply search Applitools Cypress SDK, and you'll be able to find these exact same commands. So I'm going to start off by taking that npm install command. I'm going to cancel out of my current Cypress process, and I'm going to run the npm install -d for the Applitools Cypress SDK. And what that -d is doing is it's adding it as a dev dependency, as because these are tests, we don't actually need these in any kind of production environment. But that's going to take a second and install the SDK, which it finished. But now we have the second command, and what this is going to do is it's going to basically set up all the different plugins and the commands that we need for Cypress and Applitools to work integrated with each other. Now, as we can see here, it says plugins defined, commands defined, and even TypeScript if that's your thing, and then the setup is done. Now, if we head over to the NPM, just to kind of get an idea of what actually happened behind the scenes, we could definitely manually configure this if we wanted to, because what it's really doing is it's automatically adding the plugin and it's adding the custom commands line for us. That way we don't have to do that ourselves. So it's really just a matter of convenience at that part. But now that we have that installed, we can actually get started by adding our first test. So we're going to be making these changes in that exact same cart.spec.js file that we saw before. And if we pop over back to the NPM page, we can see the example of what that usage actually looks like. So let's walk through what's actually happening here. So similar to our existing Cypress test, we're going to visit the page that we want to test, right? Then imagine a camera lens or even your own human eyes where we're going to first open up those eyes and we're going to say we want to start capturing information. We're going to define a few parameters, including our app name, where in this instance it'd be video game store, for instance. Then we want to do our test name. Maybe for this one, it's adding to cart. And then our basic browser configuration, which just to make sure that we're always consistent, we want to define that width and height. But then we have two main other commands, where first we have eyes check window, where that's going to take each individual checkpoint that we want to try to capture for our application. Now, because we're in an e-commerce store and there's multiple steps to that flow, we're going to want to capture things like the home page and maybe the product page. And of course, we want to capture that cart UI, so we're going to add a checkpoint there. And then finally, the cart itself, just to make sure that every step of the way in our product flow that we're capturing all the information that we need. So, and then finally, we have our eyes closed, which again, imagine your camera lens. We're going to put that lens cap back on. We're going to say Applitools Eyes. We want to send off all that information to the cloud so that we can get our results. So let's get started actually adding this. Now, back inside of cart.spec.js, we're going to get started by adding at the top that eyes open command. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that just to make it a little easier to get started. And we can see here we have our Cypress eyes open. And the beautiful thing about this SDK is we can use these commands on the Cy object just like any other Cypress command. So it fits right in. We don't have to import anything. It works beautifully as soon as you install and set up all those commands. But like I said before, let's actually change our app name. So let's call this Video Game Store and then or Workshop, just to make sure it's a unique name. Then the test name, let's call this adding a game to the cart. And then I'm going to leave the browser as is, but definitely configure that if you have a different preference for what size of the browser that you want to maintain for those tests. Now, again, the next thing we want to do is we want to add our first checkpoint, and we're going to do that with sci eyes check window. So the very first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add sci eyes check window. And since this is going to be our home page, I'm going to simply call that checkpoint homepage. Now, I'm going to copy that command because as we're going through, we want to add those checkpoints. Just as I mentioned, as we're going through that product flow, we want to have a checkpoint each step of the way to make sure we're capturing all the information that we need that's critical to our product flow. So as soon as we land on that product page, our game page, we want to make sure that we're landing on the right product. So I'm going to add another check for eyes check window, and let's call this one this time product page. I'm going to copy that one as well. And then once we actually add it to the cart with that click, and then we actually show the cart menu, we want to make sure that that menu is showing up right. So I'm going to again add another check window, but this time I'm going to say product page with the cart. And then finally, we want to add our final check when we actually visit the cart page and make sure that we're successfully landing on that ending cart page before we actually hit the checkout flow. So I'm going to add cart. And as we saw inside of the usage, we have one more thing, and that's adding our eyes close command to make sure that we're telling Applitools that we want to end that test and we want to start sending that information up to the cloud. Great. Now, there's one last thing that we need to do before we can actually run this test. And that is, first of all, we want to make sure we have an Applitools account. But second of all, we want to grab our API key for our Applitools account. So I'm going to open up applitools.com, where I'm going to go ahead and create my own free account. So I'm going to click Get Started here. And again, if you already have your account, now's the time that you can just log in. But I'm going to go ahead and fill this out, Colby.Fayock. And let's call this one plus Cypress workshop. I'm going to add a password there, and no matter trying to actually copy that because I'm going to absolutely change that later. So I'm going to go ahead and create my account. You can get your own free account just like this one over at applitools.com for your own application. But that's going to go in the background and it's going to start setting up the account for us. Now, the one thing that's going to happen is as soon as that happens, it's going to shoot off an email to us that we're going to need to confirm. So we can see here, I just got that notification, and I'm going to repause my notifications so that nothing actually pops up in the meantime. But I'm going to go ahead and let's see, we have our confirmation welcome email. Let's open up the dashboard and I'm going to sign in. Oops, make sure I hit the right LastPass one. Oops, I actually didn't hit the right confirmation email. So give me one moment here. I'm going to stop sharing my screen just for a moment, I think, so I can open up my email. Okay. And make sure as you're working in the background that you're confirming your email address as well. And I'm successfully confirmed. So let me reshare this and get back up. We can see that I'm back showing my screen. Okay, great. So now that we have our confirmed email account, I'm going to actually log in. So I'm going to head back over to the login page. And I think it's already logged in for me. So we can see that the very first time that we actually hit this account, we have our release information about eyes itself, but we also have this survey. Now, if this is your first time using Applitools, I recommend that you fill this out because it is helpful so that we can provide some information personalized to help you get started with Applitools. But for now, for this walkthrough, I'm going to go ahead and close this out. And we see that we have in the middle here, we have our first unresolved test. Now, this is just an example that we have inside of the dashboard to help us get running, but we're going to add our own test when we actually run Cypress in the background. So what I want out of here though, is I want to grab my API key. And if you look in the very top right, we have this little user icon, and I'm going to click this and we can see we have this this option for my API key. And as soon as I click it, we can see we have this big string. And again, you can create your own free account, so there's no use in trying to write down this key because I will also delete it later. But once I have that key, I'm going to head over to my terminal. And actually, let me show inside of the lesson 3 or exercise 3 inside of lesson 3, we show how you can actually use your Applitools API key when running the command. And we have 3 options here. Now, the first one is on the platforms that support it, you can prepend the command like this, which is going to inject that as an environment variable into the node process so that when you run sciopen, it's going to see that API key. Otherwise, if you're on a Mac, you can run export API key, or if you're on Windows, you can run set Applitools API key. Now, I'm on a Mac right now, so I'm going to use the export option. So I'm going to run export Applitools API key, and I'm going to set that equal to that key that I just copied from the dashboard. And again, that's up here under the user icon, under my API key, where you can copy it for your own command. But now we can see that we already have this set, so we can actually get started running our Cypress. So I'm going to again run npm run sciopen, which is going to start up Cypress for us. So npm run sciopen. And just like before, we shouldn't notice anything different at this point, but this is going to reopen that Cypress UI for us so that we can actually start running our test. Now, as we mentioned, as I saw before, we do have all of our checks already in here. We already set up the eyes open, all of our different checkpoints, and our eyes closed. So I think we're ready to go. So let's go ahead and run this on our original URL, which is the visually perfect one that we already have. And what this is going to do is in the background, it's going to go through all the same steps as we expected before, where it's going to navigate through our video game store. But this time we can see that it's sending information up using the Eyes SDK. It's capturing all those snapshots and screenshots, and it's using it to send up to the Applitools cloud so that we have it as our baseline. And that baseline keyword is important because this is going to be the first time that we send these up to the Applitools cloud. And our baseline is going to be what every subsequent test is going to be compared against. And we want to make sure that we have the correct baseline, which we can always change by approving ones in the future. But we want to make sure that that correct baseline is going to be able to say, hey, this next one might not look right compared to that baseline. But now we can see that everything is green and we're good to go. So let's actually see what happened inside the Applitools dashboard. So I'm going to open back up Chrome, head over to my dashboard. And if I hit the little refresh button, I'm going to snooze those notifications again. We see that we have adding a game to the cart. And we can see here, we have all those UI pictures or the pictures of the UI just like we saw inside the browser. Now, if I click this open, we can see this is our new set of baselines where we have that first video game store homepage. We can see this looks exactly like we were seeing. If we keep navigating over, we have our product page. Then we have our product page with the cart, which shows that little UI of the cart that made sure that we did successfully add it there. And then finally, after someone clicks checkout, we have our checkout page. So this is great. We have our baseline and this is already getting started. We ran our first test and of course it was successful because we're working with our demo of what should be working. But now let's actually see what happens if we go back and try to run that test with the visual bug. So if you want to grab that same URL, if you're following along with me, I have it again inside of lesson 3, just as a nice little convenience that you can grab and copy and paste. So I'm going to first close out of my Cypress process so that I can go ahead and change that URL. And then after I fix the paste, I'm going to go ahead and start back up, make sure that my Applitools API key is exported, which it should be since I'm still in the same terminal session. But I'm going to reopen my Cypress to make sure that it's starting off from a fresh session. And then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to restart that test as soon as this loads. So again, it's going to open up the same browser instance. It's going to do the same thing. And the only real difference between this and the last time that I ran it is that URL, where as we saw before, we have that bug. And we even saw it there for a quick second. Since this is a browser instance, I can hover over and see, but we saw when Applitools was capturing that information that it was able to capture that as it was going through. And we'll see in a second, after it's finished posting all this information up to the Applitools cloud, what's actually going to happen. happen if we're going to catch this bug, which Cypress before by itself wasn't actually able to do. And already it's done. We can see in the left here that we have a red error. And in our instance, that's a good thing because we had a bug. So we want to see what happens. And we have this URL here that if you want to go directly to that test, you can go ahead and use that URL inside of Cypress. But personally, I'm just going to head back over to my Applitools dashboard, and I'm going to hit the little refresh icon, and we can see we have a new unresolved test. And we can look here and see that maybe these first two look exactly right, but if we keep navigating through, we see that we have this highlighted differences. Now let me make this bigger. We can see that Applitools was able to find that issue, and that's a big issue because again, that's going to prevent our customers from actually being able to check out and purchase something on our site. But Applitools is able to capture that and say, hey, there's something wrong here and you need to take a look at it. Now, let me show you a quick look at what that actually looks like. The code that we actually run or using to change that, I have in a nice little pull request here that we can actually see what the code is that's getting changed there, where in the navigation, all I'm doing is I'm setting a position of relative and a z index of 1. That's just CSS that's changing what's happening visually inside of our application. So in this instance, we were able to test our CSS. But even cooler than that is if we see this little icon here, the little code icon for our root cause analysis, we can click that. And if we select that visual difference, we can actually see that it says that exact same thing. And we didn't do anything to connect our code base itself to Applitools. It was able to find this by looking at the code and realizing that this was the key difference that's causing this issue inside of the UI. So not only were we able to capture this important bug, we have information and context that we can give to our developers to give them somewhere to start for trying to get this fixed for our application. So now that we're great, I'm going to go ahead and switch that back, and I'm going to let that run again in the background because we're good to go. And we were able to successfully see how that looks. Let me restart that again. But we're going to move on to lesson 4 as soon as I get this running. Cypress will load, and I'm going to let that run in the background just so that we can see what happens. But now that we know that this test isn't what we want to say, hey, this isn't right. So we want to make sure we use the thumbs down here and fail this and reject it so we can tell our developers and our team that there's not something right here and that's not able to pass, and that we can make sure that that gets kicked back to the developer. Now, again, moving on to lesson 4, let's head over to our lessons. Now, the last thing that we want to look through is the ultra fast grid, which, as we talked about earlier, is an option that we can use to add additional browsers to that same test. Now, I'm not sure how familiar you are with working with cross-browser testing, but it can be a bear. There's so many different devices, and sometimes you have to write specific tests for specific browsers, and that's just a lot more to maintain. It's a lot more hassle, but instead we can use the ultra-fast grid with Cypress and the Applitools, and we can get all those benefits for our testing capabilities. So to do that, I'm going to use this snippet that I added inside of the workshop exercises here, where we have this browser object with an array of the different devices that we want to test. Now, in this particular instance, I'm here saying that I want to test on Firefox, Chrome, and an iPhone version that we have. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that. And again, we're going to make the changes right inside of that same cart.spec.js file, where I'm going to replace this browser property that we had before of just a static width and height, where now I'm going to say instead of just one browser, I want this list of browsers to actually be ran. And the cool thing is we can configure this however we want, whether we want to add other versions of different browsers, or if we want to leave it like this. You know, one of the important things about this is being able to find what actual devices are important to your site using things like analytics to see where most of your traffic is coming, because it could very well be the majority of mobile. But now that we have this test, let's actually stop and let's try to rerun this. And in the background, Cypress and Applitools are going to go through, and they're going to go through the exact same test that we had before, but it's going to do it for every single browser and device instance that we have inside of this configuration. As we can see before, inside, we're sending all that information up to the Applitools cloud. Now, again, this is mind-blowing for me because I lived in the days where I had to test things like Internet Explorer and so many different versions, and it was just mind-boggling to have to try to make sure that everything was working perfectly, visually perfect in every single browser instance. But now I can capture all the different browsers that I want, even the older IE versions, all within this browser property inside of this array where I can easily add and remove any of the different browsers that I want and make sure that I'm covering anywhere that my users are going to be located. And we can see that this is already finished. Hopefully I hit save on that. So let's go over to the Applitools dashboard, and I'm going to hit the refresh again. And we can see I accidentally kicked off another one, but we can see that we have this test here, and we have all these different browsers. We have our Chrome. Let me move this column over here. We have our Chrome for iPhone X. We have our desktop version of Chrome. We have our desktop Firefox, and we have our iPhone X with Chrome. Now let's look through, and we can see that we have exactly what it would look like on all those different devices. We have our iPhone, and we have our typical desktop view like we saw before, and we have Firefox, because we know that depending on the different browsers, while they do all conform to the same standards, sometimes things work a little bit differently, whether it's a checkbox or some kind of input value, and it just makes a big difference for how something renders. And if it's not rendering properly, that might mean that it's unusable for the people who are trying to visit your store or whatever your application is. But by being able to use the ultra-fast grid, we were able to provide a wide range of coverage for all the different devices that we want that are important to our particular store. So that's it for the demo part of this. And I would love to open this up and take questions from anybody who has any questions about what I went through today, whether it's about the Cypress eyes integration, whether it's with anything particular or the ultra-fast grid. I'm an open book, and I'd love to answer anybody's questions.
Okay, well, I'm taking a look through the questions, and Colby, I think you did a fantastic job with all of your explanations. You really made it pretty clear and precise for everyone. Don't see any additional questions posted in here. So if anyone that is still working on their tests and they have a question or two, feel free to drop it in. Colby, were there any other points you thought that you might want to mention?
If you want to learn more about any of the Applitools feature set, there's so much to see inside of the Applitools dashboard, and I really only scraped the surface of it. And if you want to learn more, definitely head over to the Applitools website or reach out to me if you have any questions, or our team is ready, or our engineers, in case you want to schedule a demo. We want to help you get up and running with visual testing because of how much impact that it can actually have.
Okay. So we've got a question here. It's, what's the best practice for sci.eyes open when having multiple it blocks?
So you still would want to have that site open for each of the, I think you'd want to have the site open for each of the, Elliot, maybe you can correct me for the best practices. Would you want to have a before all for all the different instances of sci open? I think because you want to make sure you're capturing that inside the particular test, where if you have that, it's not able to correlate that inside of the same it statements.
Okay. Elliot is one of our very helpful VRs that's on the line right now, and he may have some other additional insights. Hey, Elliot, do you have any insights to add to that?
Looks like you confirmed my answer with a yes, but if you want to mention anything particular.
Okay. All right, and looks like that's going to wrap it up for us. Give it just a few more seconds to see if anyone else has a question to add in there.
Oh, one thing I can add to that actually is if part of the reason you're asking that is because you have to re-add that same configuration for something like your app name in each one, what you can do instead is you can use an applitools.config.js file in the root of your project where you can add some of those configurations that are going to apply globally to your application. That way you don't have to re-add that in every single little configuration. And there's definitely a lot more in store for that config file than just the app name. So definitely check that out as one of the options.
All right. Okay, well, thank you so much, Colby. We really appreciate your time and all of your knowledge. You're always super awesome in supporting the community. So to everyone that joined us today, a recording of the session will be emailed to you by the end of the day tomorrow. And you can also always stay up to date with Applitools. Check us out on social or at applitools.com, and check out some of the other free resources and upcoming events that we have going on. So again, thank you
And
for joining. And
just to cut in, it looks like we did have a good question that as soon as you started talking.
Yes, that's okay. That's good. Bring them in. Bring them in.
So it looks like this question is, where do the tests run on? Is it possible to run on our in-house infrastructure with Applitools? And yes, this can run pretty much anywhere in any kind of CI environment. One thing I like to do is running on GitHub Actions, but we do support on-prem or enterprise cloud, or there's a lot of options depending on your particular needs for where the actual tests get ran. But ultimately, it's really where can Cypress run, where can these JavaScript tool runners go, and then from there, it's where the Cypress details, or rather the Applitools cloud information, where that actually gets stored, whether it's on-prem or the enterprise cloud or the typical one that we use for accounts.
And looks like there's another question in there.
Okay.
Can this be used in sites rendered by Drupal?
This can be used for any kind of website. That's the beautiful thing. As long as it can render inside of a browser, and maybe even with native mobile and stuff as well. But for Cypress particularly, it just needs to be able to render inside of a web browser, and you can test really anything. That means it doesn't even have to be a website. It can be like a game or something, and it just needs to be able to render in the browser and have a way for you to capture those different states. It looks like the questions keep coming in.
Yes, we'll keep them coming in. And Bruno, it looks like you were asking, how can you have a demo with us? Absolutely. So we will gather some information from you. Looks like, I think, Elliot, you can chat with him and he can get you set up on a demo there. The next question, does this work with Cypress Component Testing?
It absolutely does. You're able to use the API exactly the same as we have, as we showed today, where the component, you would want to run Applitools eyes, where you open it and add the checkpoints, just like you would inside of the test that we showed inside of the component test. It works exactly the same. And I even have examples. I don't have it handy for me to post here, but feel free to reach out to me on Twitter or the Applitools Twitter. My DMs are open. I'd be happy to share that with you if that's something you're interested in.
Like, awesome. All right, let's give it a few more seconds. Let's see, any more questions coming in? And need the Jeopardy theme song, something going on right here. But I think that looks like that's it. So some pretty good information. Again, if anyone has any additional questions, feel free to reach out to us on applitools.com. I believe Colby had attached some of his information there as well, and the recording will be shared again by the end of the day tomorrow. So once again, thanks so much, everyone. Oh, got another question. We're gonna keep doing this. We're gonna keep doing this to get questions coming in. Let's see. How does Applitools handle local reruns and hot reload for determining the benchmark?
I'm trying to think about what that's referring to. If you're talking about when we save the file in, because what was actually happening in the background when we hit save, Cypress is the one that was able to determine that we saved that file and re-kicked off the new test. So if that's what you're referring to, that's all handled by Cypress. But then Applitools will go through and rerun the SDK where it'll run eyes open. And there might be some like session data between the two, but ultimately the test will run just as you expect it to and be sent up to the cloud.
So there was a little clarification there. Local development in Cypress reruns, yeah.
Okay. So depending on the runner that you're using, you'll be able to use your local development environment. Because there's definitely examples that I have where I spin up a local server based on like a statically compiled site that I created, but then I'm able to run Applitools on that, if that's what you're referring to. But it depends on what you're actually trying to test, but there's definitely options to do that.
Okay. Actually, Thomas was asking that question, and I'm going to take you off on mute for a moment. So if you have any follow-ups to Colby's response or for that question, you can feel free to go ahead and if you have your mic set up. If not, you're welcome to type something else in the Q&A.
Thank you. Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep,
Yes.
we can hear you.
Hello, test. Yes.
Yes.
Sweet. Okay. So the question was, when we're locally developing, say you haven't actually completely landed on the exact design that you wanted, but you've got your eyes open and your checkpoints in place. When you're developing, there's going to be a point where you go from it not being exactly what you want to another local rerun of hot development where it is what you want. How is Applitools knowing that you hadn't got it right until this point, and then you say, okay, this is now I'm happy with it, right? And then, yeah.
So that's a great question. And really, if you have Cypress open and so that it's actually running every single time that you change the file, Applitools will also go through and keep sending up new screenshots. However, like I was showing inside the demo, when we showed that visual bug, we do have the option where it becomes unresolved if there is a difference, so that we can either reject that or frankly, we can even just ignore it if we don't really care. The point being is once we have that new baseline, that's where we can hit thumbs up and saying this is what we want the new version to be once we're perfectly happy with how it looks. And in regards to the local development, I was just remembering that it just kind of depends on if Cypress can have access to it, because ultimately Cypress is the one who's loading up the browser for us to capture that information and send it up to the cloud. So if Cypress is able to hit your local environment, then you should be good to go.
Okay.
That answer your question, Thomas? Oh yeah.
Yep. So we just need to stay on top of the Applitools dashboard and confirm our expectations there. That makes sense.
Yeah, and of course, it might also depend on how you're working that into your workflow, where maybe Applitools doesn't run on every single instance. And I know Cypress has some like I believe they have like filtering for you can dynamically have tests run in certain environments. So maybe you only want to have it run on pull request, for instance, or like when you're particularly trying to run it so that you're not getting all those false positives when you're trying to run through.
Cool, thanks.
Okay. All right. Well, looks like that is going to wrap us up this time. So thank you everyone for joining. Thank you, Colby. You all have a fantastic day. Thank you.
Take care.